This is pretty weak. Hello, hello, hello. It's been a long time since I've been on here. Thought I'd just hop on when I had a chance. Sorry about my lighting. My overhead light is out. So I just got one desk lamp here in front of me and then the one behind. All right, it's been a while since I've been on here. Just thought I would hop in for an end of year update and just Q&A if anyone has any questions or things they'd like me to talk about. Just let me know in the chat. For those of you who don't know, I do have a locals community as well. It's just Declu's Views on the locals platform. And I've got several things on there. I did a summary of a series of summaries on the chapters in DeLubac's Catholicism book. I'm up to, I think, lecture 16 on an intro to Catholic systematic theology. Got some like reflections on the Office of Readings from a while back. And occasionally I do live streams on there as well. But yeah, I hadn't been on here in a while. Thought I'd pop in, see if I could reconnect with any of the old viewers, since I don't do much on my own YouTube channel anymore. I do most of the stuff on locals now. But anyway, I thought, oh, Merry Christmas. Yeah, Merry Christmas to all of you. Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it. So it's been a very busy year, I can tell you that. So much so I was thinking before I went live, like, well, what have I done this year? And I'm like, I don't know, it's been a lot of stuff, so it's hard to remember. But most obviously, my book got published. It was released April 16th. It might have been at the 16th, The Theology of Communion, through Word on Fire. Available on their website and Amazon. It's always better for us if you buy directly from the Word on Fire bookstore, but I know Amazon's convenient for some people. But that was exciting. It seems to have gotten a pretty good reception from people. I've spoken at a number of academic conferences. I want to say 3 academic conferences this past year. I know I spoke at the Maritain conference, but I did it on, it was on St. Bonaventure. What was the actual theme? I'm trying to remember. I think it had to do with divine illumination, or his theory of knowledge, I think. I did it on, let's see, I think it was talking about Bonaventure's theory of knowledge as a basis for revelation, following Ratzinger's understanding of that. I did another presentation more recently on St. Bonaventure as well, on marriage as an aspect of human nature's social character. And that was at the American Catholic Philosophical Association. That was recently. And then I think I presented earlier in the year, but I can't remember. I think it was at St. Bernard School of Philosophy and Theology, but I don't remember what that one was about. So anyway, it's been a busy year. Obviously, this channel and my locals channel are not connected with my employer at all, but I do give you updates on what I've been doing through that. So I also run the Theology for Evangelists community in the Word on Fire Institute. So I've been doing, I just wrapped up a semester going over like an introduction to the Church Fathers, just going through, trying to present them chronologically and geographically so people understand who came when and where they were from and what their main, biographical information is, and just some of their main themes of their thought and stuff like that. Do any of you happen to know if there's a way to send a link for someone to join a stream like this? Like join me live? I'm such a Luddite when it comes to this stuff. If any of you know if you can do that, let me know. I don't know, I'm too afraid to click too many things, otherwise I'll mess up the stream. But anyway, I've been doing that. I got an article that's been accepted for publication in Pro Ecclesia on the Eucharist and Primacy and the Thought of JMRTR. It's TILLARD. It's already out in their electronic version. It's not out in the print version yet. So that's been accepted already, and it's already in its final form and available online for those who have access to Pro Ecclesia's online content. And then, let's see. Been writing stuff for Evangelization and Culture, the journal, and 2 articles a month for the Evangelization and Culture online. So continuing to do all that writing. Next semester, so starting in January, I'll be doing the Theology for Evangelist Community in the Institute. We'll be starting let me think, 2 semesters going through systematic theology. So, thank you, Lou. Appreciate that. I mean, there might be parts of the book that might go over some people's heads here and there because of the nature of theology, but in general, I mean, Pope Benedict is pretty accessible. And the main focus was to not just give an introduction to his thought on many topics, but to show how they all link together. So that was sort of the main thing. I appreciate you saying you missed my informative, balanced videos. Again, I do have a lot more videos on locals. That's where most of my stuff goes now, rather than here. But let's see. If anyone has any questions or topics they'd like to talk about, just let me know. It's been an interesting year. What have you all been up to? Let's see. We could talk about anything from theology to philosophy to fountain pens and watches. There's some fountain pens and watches are interests of mine. I'm not like an expert on them, but I do enjoy researching them, even if I can't. I have a lot of fountain pens from back in the day that I collected. I haven't bought any in a while, but Merry Christmas, James. But yeah, anyway, it's been an interesting year. A lot going on for sure. Trying to think what else. Oh, one thing you guys should check out is there's a new initiative being just started up recently. It's called Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology. If you go to ect.org, they've got, I think the first 3 articles are published, and they've got a whole list of like over 90 forthcoming articles that look really interesting. It's going to be an online platform, but you can also download PDFs if you'd rather read them in PDF or print them out, for instance. But that's very exciting. The general editor is Father Cajetan Cuddy, Dominican, and the managing editor is Dr. Matthew Minard. And they both have articles, one on just like what is theology, like an overview of theology, and then Dr. Minard's is on the development of doctrine. And they're very, very well done. And then Dr. Matthew Ramage has one on there as well that recently was published. So that's a very, very good one as well. But I suggest you check that out. I think it's going to be a great resource moving forward. It's really impressive so far. So that's something to take a look into. I'm trying to think what else. So, yeah. Any questions? I don't see anything in the chat yet, but it's good to see you guys on here. So please send some prayers. My car isn't, or one car is in the shop right now. We have to get some work done on it. It's kind of a bad timing this time of year to have major repairs done. It's not going to be a small job. So appreciate prayers on that front. But yeah, just had some time alone at home right now with my dog Bonaventure. And so I thought I'd hop on, see what people are up to. It's been a big year, and I think next year will be big as well. I don't want to talk about things too far in advance. I did do an interview at the beginning of November that's supposed to come out. Well, I don't know when it's going to come out. It was the first week of November it was recorded. I'm not going to say where it was in case for some reason they decide not to air it or something, but hopefully that'll come out soon, and you guys should be able to find that easily. I shouldn't have to tell you. But I mean, looking forward to that coming out. Let's see what else. Yeah, just doing a lot of writing and teaching, I guess, has been main things I've been doing, and traveling and presenting at conferences and things. I have more coming up in the works as well. I've been thinking about, I had some friends of mine that were interested in theology of politics. And so we've been talking about a lot of things, and there were 2 articles by, I always get one of the names wrong, but it's Father Vincent Strand and Father, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Conidera. I think I always pronounce it wrong. But 2 Jesuits, they wrote 2 articles in Nova et Vetera on Ratzinger and his political thought. And my first thought was, that they raised exactly the same hunches and questions and things that I had in my own mind, that I didn't talk about that subject in my book. And there was a lot of interesting points, but it got me thinking more about it and then doing some more rereading myself. And I think I might have a response that I might write. I started typing up a response, but then it's been a couple months and I'd have to go back and reread everything. So I don't know if or when I'll get around to it. I thought the articles were well written and well argued. I just think there's some other things we can bring in to try to solve the conundrum, because there does seem to be a tension, as they point out, in Ratzinger's thought. And I think there's a way to see Ratzinger as being closer to someone like D.C. Schindler than might be, based on selective quotes, might not seem apparent. But that's my current suspicion on that front. Are there any questions or things you guys are interested in talking about? I've got, let's see. Just let me know if there's anything on your minds or things. You guys know me. I'm not really big on current events and things. I don't really do a lot of comments on current events and things, but just feel free to ask and I'll either answer or I'll pass. But just let me know what's on y'all's minds. Walter Brueggemann. I don't think I know him. If he's German, it's Walter, or is it American? Let me look him up real quick. I'm assuming that's a U with an umlaut in the original. Is it Brueggemann Korbach? Walter. He's American, so he probably does have the E as part of his spelling then, not the original. UE usually means that the original in German is no E, it's a U umlaut. Okay, he's a Protestant Old Testament scholar, so I would really have no direct connection with him. I'm a systematic theologian, and I don't do much with Protestant stuff, although I will be doing something for the Institute, a seminar on speaking to Protestant family and friends. but I don't really do Old Testament theology much, other than how it applies to systematic theology. And I'm more into Catholic Orthodox stuff than I am Catholic Protestant as far as my own reading and writing goes. So I don't really have any thoughts on him specifically. It's one thing I've learned. You know, the more I studied theology, the more I realized how much I don't know. There's always a ton more stuff you could study. And then even out of the stuff I have studied, it's not like I remember all of it. So it really is a matter of, you know, you tend to, certain things stick, certain things don't. And that's just kind of how it is. I'm finding myself recently wanting to delve more into the scholastics. I've read let me pull it off my shelf here. This book, The Thomistic Response to Nouvelle Théologie, Concerning the Truth of Dogma and the Nature of Theology, edited by John Kerwin and Matthew Meinard. I've written a draft of a response to it. Have not completed it yet. We'll see. Hopefully I can get that published somewhere. I think it's a great book overall, and I think the Thomists in here make some very excellent points that need to be grappled with seriously. I would give some pushback a little bit on their definition of theology, or at least I'd want more clarification on what they mean when they say that it's a science and understanding science as sure and certain knowledge, because I want some more clarification on the role of theological opinion, which I think is actually a pretty big component of theology. Not everything in theology is known with certitude. Certainly a lot of things are, but not everything is. So I want more clarification on that. But I think they make some good points, especially with regards to philosophy and, you know, the limits of what's acceptable philosophy and what's not. And that the aim is knowledge of the truth. But anyway, that would take me down a whole lot of rabbit holes to try to get into all that. But been working on that a little bit. Been working on an article on Eucharistic ecclesiology as well, going back to my old roots. I haven't delved. I mean, my recent article in Pro Ecclesia is on that topic, but even that harkens back to research I did many years ago, and then I added a bunch more research to it before I submitted it for publication. But it's kind of nice to go back to my roots and talk about Eucharistic ecclesiology again, which is still one of my favorite areas of theology. Understand the relationship between the church and the Eucharist. But I do find myself wanting to delve a little bit more into the scholastics and their theology, especially as sort of like a baseline. I would like to see a little bit more common theology in the schools as a baseline for education, which then you can delve into divergences and complementary opinions, and even within scholasticism, there's room for that. But what I mean is, I am concerned that in a lot of places, it seems that one's study of theology at the undergrad and master's level in particular, those two levels, that it can end up being too eclectic in the sense of you end up studying a specific area based on the professor's favorite contemporary theologians. And I get concerned that that's not the best approach. I think we need to have more of a foundation in history of dogmas, which I don't even know of many places that teach that as a series of courses anymore. Obviously, the church fathers, the scholastics themselves, magisterial texts. And then I think it's helpful to, go into some of the other, idiosyncratic or complementary modes or other things you can add on top of that and further reflections that would complement that. But I think there does need to be some more of a baseline where everyone studies, in some sense, the similar things as the basis, and then you can get into more particular interests and stuff like that. Meister Eckhart, I think we studied him a little bit when I was in grad school in an intro to spirituality course that I took, intro to Christian spirituality course I took. But I never really studied him in depth. I know that he didn't particularly strike me. I didn't really have much of an interest in him when I read him. But no, I can't say that I've looked much into him. Most of my studies were, in many ways, focused on like the Communio school, Ratzinger, de Lubac, a little bit of von Balthasar, some Bonaventure and Aquinas for the scholastics. But, you know, I didn't really, that's the majority of my own education and work has been in those areas. But yeah, sorry I'm disappointing you today, Dorian. Bringing up people I really haven't studied much. But yeah, anything else going on? People interested in? Let's see. I was going to try to invite my buddy Chris Plants to join me on here because I tend to think that conversations work better. But I don't know how to send, I think you have to go through StreamYard or something to have more than one person. I don't know if I can actually send a link for him to join. Let's see. Oh yeah, the Itinerarium Mentis Deum. Main difference between his philosophy and Thomism, I would say they're both Neoplatonizing Aristotelians. So sometimes the difference between them is overdone. I mean, one analogy I like to use is when you talk about differences between people. Okay, like for instance, would you say that Berlin is close to Munich or not? Well, it kind of depends on your frame of reference. If you're talking about within Germany, they're not that close together, right? They're fairly far apart. If you're talking about within Europe, well, they're still kind of far, but, relatively close. If your frame of reference is the globe, they're quite close. If it's the solar system, then they're extremely close. When you talk about the scholastics, the range of difference might have been so small that they can seem to be huge differences, but they're, you compare Scotus, Aquinas, and Bonaventure, and you put them on a scale, a scale of philosophy in general, and they're quite close. I'm not saying their differences aren't meaningful. They are different at certain points, but still quite close together. Some of the big differences would be, I think, Bonaventure is more willing to criticize Aristotle more directly than Aquinas seems to do, but they both have Neoplatonizing elements, and they both, take parts of Aristotle and parts of Neoplatonism. Bonaventure obviously holds that you can know from philosophy alone that the world is not eternal, whereas Aquinas denies that. Another big point would be on their they're in the realm of their metaphysics or ontology. Bonaventure held to what's called universal hylomorphism, which posits the existence of something called spiritual matter. so that not only physical but even spiritual entities like angels are a composite of matter and form, and not just form and active existence. So Bonaventure would hold to spiritual matter and therefore universal hylomorphism. Aquinas does not. There's an interesting, I think it was in 2010 at CUA, Catholic University of America, there was actually a doctoral dissertation on that I didn't read the whole thing, but I looked into it a little bit. And it was interesting that the author, whose name I forget, basically argued that from a philosophical perspective, he don't think that debate was satisfactorily complete. He thought that there were a lot of questions that remained, and that the question just simply got dropped when Scotus sort of took over the Franciscan school, because Scotus sided with Aquinas on the question. The debate just ended without really coming to a satisfactory resolution. That's another area. I think you would find that their epistemologies or theories of knowledge have overlap, but are also somewhat different. So now Aquinas, one of the questions is whether or not he holds to an illumination theory of knowledge. It seems that, according to Ratzinger, he does, just not the same form that a Bonaventure has. And I think even someone like Christian Wagner, recently I saw him say that he does think that they agree on divine illumination. But they both do have this notion of a knowledge coming through the senses. And then Bonaventure pushes divine illumination as necessary for certitude. I've tried to look into that. I've had a conversation. It was a great conversation, a lengthy conversation with a professor emeritus at CUA, who's a Scotus and Bonaventure Franciscan school scholar, Timothy Noon, on that. And since I'm not a philosopher, I can't always remember everything he said, but very interesting. It's a very complex topic about how divine illumination works and what it actually means. So I've looked into it. I've even presented on it as a means of trying to improve my understanding, but I still don't feel like I have a solid grasp on exactly what divine illumination is when it comes to natural knowledge, because Bonaventure will distinguish between natural illumination and supernatural illumination, of course. But yeah, it's very, I think there are differences in their epistemologies, even if there's still a lot of overlap. But those are some of the big ones. Bonaventure also in general has a much more, I don't want to say pessimistic, but guarded or just view towards fallen human reason and what it can accomplish. You know, there's a quote someone sent in Latin, and the best I could, I can't give you a direct translation, but something to the effect of, philosophy is good and you should read it, but you should pass through it quickly and not get stuck. He was much more insistent on the need for divine revelation in the light of faith to purify reason. And that reason on its own is so subject to error because of our fallen state that he was more skeptical of natural reason being given too much of a prominence itself. This is how Ratzinger understands him. And so when people say he's anti-Aristotelian, Ratzinger argue, no, he's not anti-Aristotelian specifically. He quotes Aristotle approvingly over 400 times, but he is much more guarded about philosophy in general simply because of the fallen human state. So he does think it's necessary, and he obviously uses it, and he's got a fairly well-developed philosophy himself, but the primacy is always on revelation and faith as necessary for correcting reason. Aquinas seemed to be much more comfortable with the aptitude of human reason, even if, I mean, even Aquinas admits, you know, very few people can do it well, and even those who have the time and the mental capacity still will have it in a mixture of error. So he's not completely different than Bonaventure on that, but it seems like Aquinas was much more trusting in natural reason and what it could do, without denying. I mean, obviously, he would say we need revelation and faith as well, but I think Bonaventure is even more guarded than Aquinas on that point. So those are some areas where I think they have some differences. So I hope that answers the question. Bonaventure, I mean, I love Bonaventure. I recently gave away a lot of my Bonaventure books, and I don't think I'll ever see them back. So I had to go back and I purchased some replacement copies and some new stuff. So I've got a whole series of his collected works from Franciscan Press, Franciscan Institute. I taught a course on Bonaventure. I used the Itinerarium Mentis ad Deum and the Reduction of the Ars to Theology and stuff like that. And I really love Bonaventure a lot. I also used his Breviloquium, which is a great. I actually used that also, not only in that course, but in a course on Introduction to Catholic Theology. I used that as a basis for the systematic portion as well. In one of the semesters I taught that course, I did as sort of like a base, for them to read and work off of. So any other questions or topics y'all are interested in? Like I said, I'm kind of wanting to delve more into the scholastics, including the 20th century scholastics more. I'm looking forward to. I purchased the book 1 and book 2 on Catholic Dogmatic Theology, a synthesis by Jean-Hervé Nicolas. That's volume 1 on the Trinitarian Mystery of God, and book 2 on the Incarnation and Redemption. I used some of this in an article for the Evangelization and Culture Online. It was on the cross. I think it was something I wrote for Good Friday this past year, and I used a good chunk of that. So you have a theology of history comparable to Bonaventure? Not that I'm aware of. I think Bonaventure obviously is probably a little bit more explicit on that point. I don't really consider myself an expert on either of them. I think, because of his collations on the 6 days of creation, it comes out a lot in there. And of course, Ratzinger has helped us understand that because of his own approved Habilitation Schrift, second dissertation. It's more obvious to me that Bonaventure had a theology of history. I don't know if Aquinas has something comparable. It's a great question, though. I sometimes do think the Thomists get somewhat of a bad rep about being ahistorical. I think that can be pushed too far, because obviously they take history seriously because they take the Incarnation seriously. I mean, I think you could argue that Christocentrism is as true for Aquinas as it is for someone like Bonaventure. I mean, the whole Summa and the corpus of Aquinas, a lot of it hinges on the divine and human unity in Christ. And, I actually wrote a paper in grad school. I took a course on the Incarnation and Passion in St. Thomas Aquinas. And my paper was on the centrality of the headship of Christ, because it really is sort of a linchpin. Like, you look at the Incarnation and it's sort of like the nexus where everything meets. Your Trinitarian theology meets your anthropology, meets your sacramental theology, your ecclesiology. It's all based on the grace of headship, which then is the means by which the grace of Christ gets transmitted to the members, right? So, I mean, the Incarnation is definitely historical. They certainly would be big on the history of salvation. So I think the critique of ahistorical Thomism can be overdone. Yeah, Thomas' scripture commentaries, which are all coming out. I believe Emmaus Academic is publishing all of those. And there's also this book by Word on Fire, which is Selected Commentaries on the New Testament. Thomas Aquinas, Selected Commentaries on the New Testament, edited by Jason Payon, he recently completed his doctorate at CUA as well. But he's our, I might get the title wrong, but he's like the editor of Word on Fire Academic. So he put this together, and I like the way he did it, because he, instead of just going through each commentary separately, he put it into categories. So, for instance, part 1, From the Father, the being incarnation of the Word. You have chapter 1, the divine and human generations of Christ, and he puts one after the other his commentary on John chapter 1, verses 1 to 2, and then commentary on Matthew 1:1. And chapter 2, he covers John chapter 1, verse 3 and 4, and Hebrews chapter 1, verses 10 to 12. So he took, instead of going through each book separately, he did it thematically and then put together the different scriptural commentaries in the New Testament that talk about that specific theme. And he put those together. So instead of just going through John and then going through Matthew and then going through Hebrews or John, I mean, let's look at a good example here. I'm trying to see one. So like chapter 9, application of Christ's gifts and the sacraments. It includes commentaries from Hebrews, Romans, the Gospel of John, 1 Corinthians, and Matthew. So you get, put together his commentaries that touch on that theme. So I really like the way this book is laid out. Also, it's just a beautiful book, isn't it? I mean, might be biased, but Word on Fire does a great job with those sorts of things. Beautiful books. Yeah. Let's see. Any other questions or themes? Hi, Haley. Merry Christmas, Uncle Nick. Good to see you on here. It's my uncle, Dominic DeNovo. It's one thing I miss about living in Ohio is I have so many great family members still there, and I don't get to travel up there as much anymore. So it's kind of sad being away from the homeland of Ohio. Let's see. What else? Any other questions, themes? And feel free to ask about some controversial things if you wish. I might not answer them, but you're free to ask. No. 4th year in a row. Is that right? 4th year in a row? Not happy about this, Tom. Sorry. Somehow hoping that Ohio State can come through and just end up winning the championship anyway. But I don't know. I mean, are we up against Oregon again? Is that our next game? Let's see. Yep. On New Year's Day, we got to beat Oregon. It's going to be a tough game. I don't have cable, so I used to watch soccer and stuff. I plan to do more content on my channel. Of course, I'm an Ohio State fan. I was born in Columbus. Both sides of my family are from the Columbus area. Delaware, Ohio, just north of Columbus, and also north of Columbus, Galena, Sunbury area. I still have family in that area. All right. Am I planning to do more content on my channel? I'm not sure. I have to figure out what I'm going to do. Obviously, I can only do things because this channel and my locals community are not tied to my employer at all. I have to get through my work before I can do anything else on the side. I was trying to do locals as a way of justifying the work I do, but I'd only have like 12 or 13 supporters on there. So makes it kind of hard. I've got to figure out a way to funnel more people into locals to make it worthwhile. So I still would like to have a bunch of exclusive content on locals, but I might have to try to do more on YouTube as a means of, I'm starting to realize you kind of have to have YouTube and then funnel people who are interested for more content onto locals. Because there's just not enough advertisement for locals communities. YouTube has a much wider audience. So I'm trying to get people to go over to locals, but I know that's also difficult because, you know, monthly subscriptions to locals communities, you know, there's only so many of those people can afford and do. So, well, what's your team, Haley? All right, let's see. Dorian, I've heard you once say that divine freedom is key to the nature grace debate. Have you had any more reflection insights on how to understand divine freedom? Not too much. Yeah, that was based on a paper I did in grad school on divine freedom in the nature and the debate over nature and grace. And it just, yeah, it dawned on me that they were arguing about divine freedom, but neither side, from what I read, was really defining divine freedom and how it works. I have seen other works coming out on the nature grace debate. There's a recent, I don't know, it's in, actually, I can tell you because I sent it to Dom from the Logos Project. Let me see if I can find that message. Oh, it was actually published in 2022. That's weird because he sent it to me. It's an article. The author sent it to me before it was in print. He sent me like a Word document version of it, but it was he's a Thomist philosopher. I met him at the Maritain Association conference. He teaches out in, I believe it's on the West Coast. I want to say it's in San Francisco. Let me see if I can find Michael Torre, The Natural Desire to See God, The View of Thomas Aquinas. And it's in this book called Restoring Ancient Beauty, The Revival of Thomistic Theology, edited by James Keating. And it's available through the American Maritain Association, which I am a member of. And it's Michael Torre. It's a really long, I mean, it was like 50 or 60 pages in the version he sent me. And he's a Thomist, you know, philosopher. And he doesn't directly deal with de Lubac specifically, but it seems to me that he really comes down on the same side as de Lubac without relying on de Lubac, just going through the Thomistic sources. And he basically holds that, I mean, very similar view to Bonaventure, I mean, to de Lubac. I don't know if you'd agree with him on every point, but it was an excellent article. One of the best I've read and very convincing in my book. Thoughts about Catholic Orthodox celebrating the Council of Nicaea together? Any headway on reunification? I mean, I think it's great that we celebrate it together. Obviously, Catholic Orthodox dialogue is one of my areas of interest. I haven't been able to do much with it that recently. Again, my Eucharistic Ecclesiology article I'm working on talks about it a little bit. I'm hoping so. I think, you know, the 20th century saw, the second half of the 20th century, early 21st century have seen a lot of progress in Catholic Orthodox dialogue, but there's still just so much. Well, one, the Orthodox themselves are currently in schism, so that doesn't help. We have Moscow fighting Constantinople. I think maybe not as much in the actual, I'm not really privy to what goes on in the actual International Commission meetings, but you're seeing a lot of back and forth amongst Catholics and Orthodox online. I saw an article yesterday. I didn't finish reading it, but it was one that Eric Ibarra had recommended on his Facebook. It was a former Eastern Orthodox who converted to Catholicism who was responding to Kyle King in his article, and it was pretty good. I think a lot of it's still going to have to deal with the papacy in the first millennium. I think that has to be hammered out. And the Catholic Orthodox Dialogue had come to a joint document on that question that the Catholic and Orthodox theologians agreed with, and they signed off on it. And then the Orthodox side refused to accept the document. So it did get leaked. So it is available online, but it was not supposed to be published because it wasn't approved. But I think that primacy in the first millennium is still the linchpin. And I think, in doing my series on the Church Fathers for the Institute, and then like you look at the article by the gentleman whose name I don't remember, that he went into a lot of detail on it. There's just so many quotes from the early fathers, East and West, about the papal primacy that even Orthodox scholars will admit certain things that just seem completely damning to their case. So I don't really know what else there is to say about it. I think there needs to be some sort of dispassionate, serious, intellectually honest view of it. And, it's always difficult because when you're in polemics and, fighting for your side, it's hard for people to look at the same data honestly. And I think that's kind of where we're at on that process. You see people going both ways, right? And it's interesting, but you just look at the early church history on it, and it just seems so obvious that there were strong papal claims going way back early in the patristic era that it's hard for me to really understand how that can be denied from an intellectually honest approach. All right, thoughts about the social kingship of Christ. Yeah, I know. All right, Chris, you can put me on the spot. So many ways of trying to approach that question. As you know, I am not an expert on, nor have I studied in depth theology of politics. I do find myself leaning more and more towards some sort of post-liberalism. I don't know exactly which version of that. I think, and again, I think this ties to the whole nature and grace debate. On the one hand, I was reading through the Gospel of John earlier today. I think I was reading through, it was 4 chapters. What were they? I think 16 to 19. I think 16 to 19. And there's certain passages where you're like, well, all right, he is, there does seem to be a distinction between his kingdom and kingdoms on earth. Yet at the same time, there does seem to be a need. I don't think society can function in its ideal form without an acknowledgement of divine revelation and submission to revealed truth, which is where I think the traditional doctrines on the obligation of individuals and societies to acknowledge divine revelation when it is sufficiently proposed, and therefore societies should be built upon the truths that come from revelation and not just natural reason. I don't think the political sphere can or should be completely secular. I think because at the same time, the state does not have direct control over spiritual matters, of course, but it should be defending those truths. In some sense, it should be privileging the Catholic faith when it knows that that's the reality. And in some ways, I do think a Catholic state should be a goal, but you have to, because politics is a practical science, you have to work within what's possible in the given circumstances. So you're not going to take a predominantly Protestant country and make it Catholic overnight by top down. I think this is where Ratzinger might seem like he's more on the side of the liberals. But I think it's more of just a practical thing. Like, you have to convert the members of the society, and then once you've achieved a conversion, then the society can be ordered more easily and readily and more perfectly towards the truth of the faith. I used to be more on the side of, oh, well, no, there's just natural law and natural reason. You can use that. And that's certainly true. But it just seems more and more that without the aid of revelation and faith, even the grasp of the natural law is so imperfect. So I do think, when you look at a society, how do you have a society that doesn't have the same vision of the highest end and the highest goal and the supreme standard by which you judge? Because every society has to make judgments, right? And I don't know how you have a real society that doesn't have a shared vision of the highest truth and the highest good. And so I do tend to think that ideally there should be more of an explicit recognition of the true faith. Yeah. And, it's difficult because, especially when you live in a society that's not unified at all, there are a lot of problems come with that. And I think part of my rationale is this. I had an argument once with someone, and I think we're talking about the abortion issue, and they're saying, well, you shouldn't legislate morality. Well, first of all, almost all legislation is moral, right? It's talking about justice, which is a matter of moral, of ethics, right? And justice is rendering people their due. And part of my argument was, I said, well, technically speaking, the law does not, in and of itself, demand assent to the reasons behind it. And what I was trying to say is, you can have two people that agree on a policy or law that don't agree on why. And so the law itself, obviously people propose laws based on some sort of argumentation, but you can come to the same conclusion for different reasons. And you might have to follow the law without agreeing with the reasons for that law. And you might have different reasons for the same law. But my point is, you can't have any law that doesn't have some sort of philosophy behind it. So why does it matter whether it's religious or philosophical? I mean, you could easily say the same thing. Well, don't legislate your modernist philosophy on me either, right? I mean, anytime you have a law, you have people making propositions for laws based on their own philosophy. There's no way to avoid that. There's no such thing as a completely non-philosophical or non-ideological law in that broader sense of ideological. So don't all citizens and all people in government have a right to be pushing the principles that they hold to be true? I mean, that's just how it functions. So ideally, for society to work properly, it would be the principles that come from God himself, whether known naturally or supernaturally. So I think we should be pushing, Christ should reign in society, because we are social animals. He came to redeem us, but it's not just individual. He came to redeem us as a people, and that we should be trying as a people to order society to the will of God. And we know that most perfectly through the divine revelation. And I don't really see a way to argue that we shouldn't do that. I mean, if you're going to have some sort of philosophy governing society, shouldn't it be that which comes from God himself? So I guess those are my thoughts. All right. Many theologians, John Milbank, William Kavanaugh, are Problematizing the conceptual basis of church state and sacred secular distinctions. Do you think it's possible to think politically without them? To think politically without them. By them, do you mean without people like Milbank or Kavanaugh, or without some sort of elements of this viewpoint? Oh, well, I mean, I think there are distinctions. I mean, at least, I mean, you look at Catholic doctrine and it's very nuanced, right? In some sense, the hierarchy of the church shouldn't necessarily be in direct control of the civil order, but the civil order should be taking its cues from the principles laid forth in Revelation and theology. But, you know, the church is not really it would put forth principles in the moral order that should be considered when deciding on right policy, right? But the policy is still going to be effectuated by the lay leaders of the civil government. So I think a distinction, just like nature and grace, there is a distinction. Even de Lubac says that. He doesn't deny the distinction between nature and grace at all. He very explicitly affirms it. There is a distinction between the temporal and the spiritual orders, but the good of the temporal order, in some sense, can only be achieved when it is subordinated to the higher end. So the good of society does depend upon the virtues and that sort of thing. So there's a distinction, but I don't think you can have a radical separation. And is it possible to think politically without them? Maybe. But I also think it's somewhat of I'm just not convinced it's possible to have a society that doesn't have some sort of principle, at least implicitly in its structure and organization and in its policies. The only question is, what is that philosophy that's dominating? What is it that is ordering society? What are the principles, and where are you getting those principles? I don't think you can, and historically that was often done through a common religion and common culture, cultus, worship, which is why you had such difficulties between the church and the state in the early Roman Empire, right? Because we refused to recognize the cult of the Roman gods. But at the same time, as Ratzinger points out, he takes the Israelites in exile in Babylon, looks at what Jeremiah says to them. What are they supposed to do? Well, they're obviously not in control. They live in a state that has a completely different religious system. So what do? Work for the good of your society. You know, be good to your neighbors, try to befriend them, work for their good, show them that you are a good citizen in that sense, and all things that you can be without, of course, falling into idolatry. So I think Ratzinger's perspective is basically, you got to take the society you're in and work for its improvement. But a lot of times those circumstances are far from ideal and might even be hostile to the faith. You still work for the good of that society. And so you order your civic action in alignment with the gospel, and then that will help purify the state from within. And eventually you can convert it, you know, and that's sort of like the means of doing it. Right, Chris, exactly. The church has used the terminology in her own magisterial documents. I don't think there's a way to get around the distinctions, but they also needs to be, there's a distinction, but they need to operate in some sort of unified fashion. And I'm not saying it's easy to figure out exactly how to do that. And it does seem to be that even some form of religious liberty is present even in a Catholic state, because conversion is not done coercively in a strong sense, right? So you don't convert by the sword, so to speak. So, but that doesn't mean that society shouldn't be trying to privilege right reason and the truth of the gospel in some way. But yeah, those are very difficult questions and not at all easy to hammer out in the concrete. Like, what are you actually going to do? Like, what are you going to legislate and what aren't you going to legislate? Yeah, very, very interesting questions indeed. Let's see. Any other questions, comments, topics? Calvin argues that temporal and Augustine refers primarily to time rather than space. Therefore, we should not speak of temporal realm, which has its own proper rights. Thoughts? I'm not entirely sure what temporal looks like without space, though. I mean, in angels, maybe. I don't know. I do think there is a temporal order, but that really just has to do with they're not. Again, there's a distinction, but not a complete separation. So the temporal good typically refers to those goods which are due with the common good of the society, right? So questions of justice and proper administration of goods and services and the ordering of institutions that work for the common good and deciding on things like, you know, speed limits. Like those sorts of questions are not directly tied to salvation. You know, what's the tax rate supposed to be? What's, you know, where the house codes and like where are we going to allow certain buildings to go up? And those sorts of questions are important for the well-being of society, and they're only sort of tangentially tied to eternal life. But then there are things like, you know, the moral good of society, you know, which decency laws, like, you know, we could probably use a little bit more of those, right? So there are certain things that touch upon both because they deal with the moral order. They do have a tie to eternal life, even if, you know, there's things like natural virtues, you know, so the natural law known through reason, those do pertain to eternal life. So there is overlap there. So I think there's a distinction, but they're not entirely separate. I think the general idea is that a bishop is not granted a special grace when it comes to making policy about the secular matters. I mean, that's basically what Vatican II says too about the role of the laity. Like part of the role of the laity is to be the ones that take the principles of morality and religion and conform this society in its temporal order as best it can to those principles. And that's not going to be done directly by the hierarchy. So I think part of the issue is the notion of if you have too much of a drastic separation between church and state, you don't see how those two things go together. Like, you know, even as Dr. Miner and I have talked about this, like talking about nature and grace, you're really on a razor's edge. And I think the same is true between the temporal and spiritual orders, because they might be distinct, but they're not they're not unrelated. And so part of the difficulty in the nature and grace question is how do you have grace perfect nature as nature without destroying nature as nature at the same time? Like you can't have grace be, it must perfect nature qua nature, right? It must be the perfection of the nature itself. It can't be something completely separated. So I think something is similarly true. Like when you're trying to build a society, you know, you have to have, it must be rightly ordered towards the higher order or subordinated to it in some way. But that doesn't mean that there isn't some autonomy, you know, because there are prudential decisions that are not going to fall under the purview of the hierarchy. And I think that's where it comes into, like, if, you know, if, so it really does have to do with who is in charge of making which decisions. And there's a certain principle of subsidiarity there. And while the bishops and the magisterium have a role to play in enlightening the minds of the people to know what those principles are, those do need to be applied. And it is the job of the state to implement those with regards to civil law in a prudential manner. I think the problem comes in when it's like, oh no, we don't even need any of that. We can make our decisions without it. I think you run into serious problems. But I still think there probably would be some right of the civil realm. I'm trying not to use the word secular because I think it's tainted with unnecessary assumptions of a complete separation from revelation and faith, which I don't think is true. So, but I do think there's some autonomy there, you know, that there are, it's not always obvious that one law must be the case. You know, there are different ways. I mean, even Aquinas talks about different forms of government, and he argues for why one is better than the other and all of that. I think the only difference is, like, you know, in a true theocracy, you end up having like the Pope being the universal emperor or the bishop being the king, and that's not our position. But the idea that the secular rulers should be implementing the principles gained through reason and faith is, I think, the way I would understand it, which is different than a full theocracy. I'm not putting with you all. They're great questions. God bless and Merry Christmas. Yeah, Milbank is an interesting character. I've read some of his stuff. I agree with some of his stuff. I sometimes have been critical of his interpretation of certain thinkers. I read an article that someone was working with him this is probably 15, 20 years ago. They sent me an article that he was co-writing with someone on Rahner. And I was like, no, I think you guys are misrepresenting Rahner. And then I might have some similar critiques of his views on de Lubac, but it's been so long since I read The Suspended Middle. I don't know what they are. But he's certainly a very intelligent man and an interesting writer and figure, to say the least. Yeah, let's see. All right, any other questions, comments, topics? Let's see. If you had to pick 5 topics for 5 books to write on, what would they be? Well, I should probably say Ratzinger on Revelation, since I had started writing a book on that, based on my dissertation, but more streamlined and simplified. So I would like to finish that at some point. So that's one. I probably would be interested in writing something on nature and grace, but there's so many books out there. It's like beating a dead horse. I don't know how much interest there is in yet another person putting their hat into the ring. There's just so much written on it already, but I do find that people are still confused by it. So it might be a worthwhile endeavor, but I would probably enjoy doing that. So that would be 2. I'd considered writing something on the Eucharist and primacy. So sort of a Eucharistic ecclesiology of the papacy based on separate works that I've done. So the one on Teilhard, and then my article in Novae Vetera on Ratzinger and Zizioulas. So I've thought about that would probably be a third possible topic. I mean, ecclesiology in general, but there's already tons of good ecclesiology books out there. So 3, 3, let's see. I already did one on Benedict's thought in general, so that's already done. So we won't count that. Let's see. About Mary, any Marian interests? I'm interested in Mariology. It's not really, but I'm more into Marian devotion. I don't know if it's a topic that I myself would want to do a whole lot of work in. I'm always interested in seeing other people's works on that. I don't know if I would want to write my own book on Mary. Spiritual books. Probably not. I don't consider myself enough of a mystic to be giving spiritual writings. Let me see. What else would be an interesting book to write on? This might be a little difficult to do, but something on like a rapprochement between communio and scholasticism. Trying to show, I mean, I would probably have to do the differences as well, but showing I'd probably be emphasizing in a book like that the commonalities, like showing how traditional the communio school really is and how they might come at theology somewhat differently and have their own methods and modes of expression. But when it comes to fundamental principles, there's still a lot of unity between communio and Thomists or scholastics at large on when it comes to the actual specific questions. I mean, obviously the debate over nature and grace is a big one, but I think you're seeing more and more Thomists even admit, like Michael Torre, that de Lubac had a point, and so that might be a stretch, but that would be another possible topic. I think something on theological method would be nice, but I probably wouldn't be an expert enough to do that. But I only say that because I'm very, those of you who know me know I'm sort of torn when it comes to, no, Chris, bad. It's not NT. If you meant New Testament, that'd be one thing. If you mean Nouvelle Théologie, slap on the wrist. Communio. I don't like the term Nouvelle Théologie. It's a bad term. So ressourcement maybe. But in particular, the Communio theologians is what I have in mind. Because even within ressourcement, I'm sure you have a lot of, it's even within that camp, you have some differences. Yes, Communio Kumbaya. So I would like to see some stuff on theological method, because I do think the nature and methods of theology are really where a lot of the issues are coming up. Because this is where I find myself the most torn. Because one might be tempted, I think the Thomists would say that the community of school are basically just good, positive theologians, but I don't really accept that as a caricature. And I've heard some other bigwigs tell me this directly. Well, they would just say that they're good positivists. I'm like, well, no, like they do some positive work, but you can't tell me de Lubac and Ratzinger are just doing positive theology, because they're not just doing history of thought. They're not just telling you they are systematically bringing things together and elaborating on them and then communicating them for the contemporary time period. That is systematics. The fact that they draw more explicitly on the fathers doesn't mean that it's not systematics and that it's just positive theology. But that would be an area where I think, the Thomists, in some sense, agree in principle that positive theology is a foundation for systematic theology or dogmatics. I think the question becomes how narrow is your sourcing, I think is a big question. So it's an area where I get torn. I tend to swing back and forth between the ressourcement communio side and the scholastic side on those things, because I do see a lot of value in scholasticism that I think appeals to my earlier self, my younger self, in that I kind of still have some nostalgia for, while still appreciating immensely the work of like the communio theologians who don't follow that trajectory. So I don't know whether they're complementary methods, or if the emphases are different, or if their sources are just more broad. So are they complementary methodologies or complementary with regards to sourcing? So something on that might be intriguing. I don't know that I'd want to actually write that book, because I would probably find it immensely boring. But it's definitely one that I think needs to be done to have a real rapprochement. And a lot of that, I think, does have to do with the role of philosophy in theology, which is something I wish I had studied more in depth. Because I do tend to think that the scope of allowable philosophies, especially metaphysics, is fairly narrow. I think the philosophy is actually more narrow than the theology sources. And that's where the Nouvelle Théologie tended to fail, was not engaging with modern philosophy too much. I mean, you have to engage with philosophies that are going on, right? But there were certain members of the Nouvelle Théologie that did sort of push this, we can use Marx and Kant and other modern philosophies just as well as they could use Bonaventure and Aquinas or Plato and Aristotle. And I just don't agree with that. I think, ironically, right reason is more narrow than what we know through the truth of revelation and the tradition. So I think allowable philosophies are actually more narrow. And I think that's one place where I think the Thomists kind of got it right, although they might be a little more narrow than I would, or more restrictive than I would want to be. But I do think, for instance, I think you need some form of realist metaphysics is absolutely necessary. I don't think you can base your theology on a philosophy that denies metaphysical realism and epistemological realism. I just don't think it's possible. I think it's in some sense, a philosophical presupposition for the truths of the faith to be understood as such, and for the dogmas themselves, that there be metaphysical truth that is knowable. So, what do I think about Balthazar's divine aesthetic as including the cross, ugliness, and flaws? Does it justify bad art? What does it mean for an evangelism of beauty? I don't know as much about Balthazar's divine aesthetics. I appreciate his notion. There's a line he has, I don't know if it was in Raising the Bastions or something else, where he was reflecting on a prior work where he says something like, an aesthetical theology is the only true theology or only real theology. And what I took him to mean is simply that, look, the truth is beautiful. And if your theology doesn't have some sort of beauty to it, it's failing in some ways. And again, this is where I get torn between the Communio side and the Thomist side, because I mean, like, I think Garrigou-Lagrange is absolutely brilliant, but reading through his 2 volumes on divine revelation, oh my gosh, like it is dry. It is very dry. It doesn't mean it's wrong. And if you can take a big, the beauty is something you can only appreciate if you can see the whole. As you're going through it, it's not that beautiful. It's dry and it's boring, and it's hard to follow and keep your attention on it. And I can understand why there was some reaction against that sort of approach. And yet I think there's also a way of appreciating scholasticism as actually being a form of beauty. In that I think you can have both modes of expression as proper to theology, or I should say appropriate to theology. As far as divine, I don't know as much about. I read some of Balthazar's like shorter works. I never delved into Balthazar. I took a doctoral seminar course on his early works, and I've done reading on his like shorter monographs. I never went into his multi-volume series, so I don't know as much about his approach to those things. Does it justify bad art? I would tend to think not, but I do think there is something beautiful about the economy of salvation. There is I think there's something to the notion that one reason God allows sin and the fall and all that is because the redemption is even more beautiful than the fall is ugly, in that it does somehow make it worthwhile. So while it's not directly willed in a positive sense, there is a beauty to the providential redemption of mankind that would not be possible without the cross. Like, there is a reason we have crucifixes, right? And we love them. And contemplating the love of Christ on the cross is something you would not have without that ugliness of human sin. And so I can appreciate that. I don't know how that would relate to bad art. I don't know. I think there's beautiful ways of portraying ugly things, if that makes sense. The cross might be a prime example of that. I'm reminded of, I know this is only a literary analogy, but I finished reading The Lord of the Rings recently, finally. So then I started reading the Silmarillion, and I don't remember where I left off, but you have the whole his own creation account in the Silmarillion, Tolkien. And you have, I think it's Melkor, is that his name? I don't know. He's trying to do his own thing and doing these dissonant chords, and then Iluvatar comes in and like somehow is able to turn that discordance into a chord by incorporating the discordance into the beauty of the theme of the music. So even in trying to rebel, it's impossible. And I think there's actually a beautiful analogy there with regards to sin and redemption. So that even ugliness becomes beautiful. And we see that in, movies or plays or things of that sort, where, without the evil enemy, the the beauty of valor and courage and those virtues are almost not even able to be exercised without the opposition, right? Can you have courage without there being some sort of evil, whether moral or just natural, that one has to face? And so there can be a beauty that comes out of those flaws and imperfections and ugliness. And I think the redemption of mankind is a prime example of that. But that's just based on my own thoughts on the words. I don't know enough about his theological aesthetics to speak more intelligently than that. But I do think, as far as the evangelism and beauty, I think he's onto something with regards to the power of starting with beauty rather than and working back through the transcendentals. Although can I just say, this is one of my pet peeves when people talk about the three transcendentals being unity, truth, and truth, goodness, and beauty. Like, we always forget that unity is actually one of the three transcendentals. Beauty is disputed as one of the transcendentals. Some say it's just an aspect of goodness, or goodness considered under a certain aspect. Others argue that it's a fourth transcendental. But I think I don't have a problem with people talking about truth, goodness, and beauty, but I think it's a mistake to forget unity, because I think that's at the heart of the mystery of the Trinity and is part of the meaning of Catholicism, for instance, itself, is that unity. And I think unity is often forgotten in discussions of the transcendentals. I think that's a mistake. But I do think a lot of people are actually converted through the beauty of the faith and the beauty of salvation history. And I think that might be part of why, in the Gospels, like, what's the first word in evangelization, spreading the good news? Repent. Why? Because you're a wretch, you know it, but you can be redeemed. Like, it's the hope of redemption that makes repentance possible, right? That's how you don't end up in despair. So the beauty of redemption itself, I think, is very powerful. And I do think the beauty of the faith is very potent when it comes to evangelization. Ratzinger has a great phrase where he basically says that the two greatest arguments or compelling reasons for Catholicism are the lives of the saints and Catholic art, including music, architecture, those sorts of things. So those are like two of the greatest apologetic tools and evangelizing tools, are the beauty of the faith expressed in the lives of the saints and in our artistic patrimony. Now that Chris made me list 5 topics for books, he's going to try to hold me to that, isn't he? Let's see. Yep. So yeah, this is where, one thing that I find difficult, because you start really realizing how limited you are as a finite human being, not only with your intellect, but also, for me, particularly my memory, but your time and your mental and physical energy. So you really appreciate the fact that, I do think in some sense, theology does need to be a communal activity. This is where I think Lonergan had something right. I'm not saying I would full-throatedly agree with his book method. um, but he has an important insight, which is like, look, you have these different functional specialties, but they need to work together. Like I look at something like, I don't necessarily think, how do I put this? I don't have any problem with scholasticism continuing on its own terms. It's a good one, Chris. It's not good for man to be alone equals theological or original theological method. So ideally, I could, as an individual, become a master of sacred scripture, which is why, I mean, let's put it this way. The scholastics, the high scholastics are really the prime example because they became masters of the sacred page first. And that was a prerequisite for them to do their more systematic works. We don't really have that much anymore. Like, yes, I had to take many Bible classes in my studies because of my degree programs. But I wouldn't consider myself a master of the sacred page. And I think that's a weakness. And partly because as the generations move on, the amount of literature available becomes so vast, it's insane. I do worry that I'm getting on another tangent. Let me stop there and try to go back. I'm feeling my inner Father Pine come out, where I'm having to stop myself and get back on track. What am I going to say? Like, I really admire the work of someone like Michael Barber and Brant Petrie and those guys and Scott Hahn doing, John Bergsma. I'm sure I'm missing a bunch of solid names here. Edward Shree, like all those guys doing great biblical-based theology. I think that's so important. And I think that's something that if like Aquinas were alive today, he would be doing. Like he would be engaging with a lot of biblical scholarship. Now, part of the issue is there's been so much bad biblical scholarship that it's so important to have good biblical scholarship coming out. But then then you have, I really do admire the work of someone like Michel Labordette and even Garrigou-Lagrange and a lot of the scholastic thinkers. I think Father Cajetan Cuddy is a brilliant theologian. I love listening to him. I had a great 2.5 hour conversation with him at a conference recently. And even though I'm more communio and he's more Thomist, I think we had a lot in common. And I really appreciate that scholastic approach. Like they go for precision, and that's something that I will admit that the communio school sometimes lacks. It doesn't always have the precision. It doesn't always get into some of the specifics. It can tend to be a little bit more general, and because it's more sapiential in that sense, it paints with broad strokes, which is also helpful, right? It helps you see the forest. The Thomists are good at helping you see the leaves on the tree, but in some sense, while it might be ideal for someone to be able to know sacred scripture backwards and forwards, know the church fathers and all of them backwards and forwards, know the scholastics and all the nuances there backwards and forwards, know more contemporary stuff, although I'll be honest, I think that's somewhat less important. It's just not actually possible. So in some sense, the way that Lonergan puts it, if you look at his functional specialties and the way they relate in their order, me as a dogmatic or systematic theologian, I need to rely on good books written by good biblical and patristic scholars that can summarize for me the main lines of those fields so that I don't have to go and do that primary research all on my own. Because by the time I got through all of that work on my own, I'd basically be at the end of my life, not able to do the systematic stuff. So there is a sense in which it needs to be a team effort where you've got theologians working on the biblical data, others working on the historical theology. So the positive theologians writing works accessible for the systematic theologians like myself to be able to do our work better, and good scholastic synthesizers that can help us understand the best of the scholastic tradition, because it's just not possible for one person to do all of that. And that way, you have a team effort where, and I think theology kind of needs that. And the one concern I have about contemporary Thomism, maybe less so than in the past, but is that it does seem, and again, it seems, and it could just be due to my lack of knowledge about some of this, that how much direct engagement with scripture study do they do, or patristics, right? Or is it mostly based on internal conversations among scholastics of one tradition? And that's where the Resource Monk guys were pushing back. Like, well, wait a minute. Well, what about Bonaventure over here? What about, the Cappadocians? What about what they had to say? Like, can we bring anything in from them? In some ways, I still think the high scholastics are sort of like, they are in some ways, and this is what I think Leo the 13th was getting at, they are prime examples because they were able to do all that, but they're also 800 years ago, and they don't have 800 years of added literature to wade through. So I don't know. All that's to say that I think all those different fields need to be brought together somehow, and our education needs to be structured accordingly. And I think even our work needs to be structured accordingly. All right. Spicy question. Who's the most harmful philosopher in history? Again, I'm not a philosopher. I would think, practically speaking, probably Marx. Just because I think the way he has impacted nations and the world negatively is just so strong. And, Marx is one of Ratzinger's biggest foils, right? I think he's done some of the most damage out of all of them. Because I can see redeeming things. Obviously I think Kant had some things pretty wrong. But he not nearly as dangerous as someone like Marx. I think Marx led to a lot of the wokeism. Now, there might be other philosophers that influenced him that you might be able to point to that I'm just not as familiar with, because I didn't really do much study of modern philosophy. I don't know. There's a lot of names I could throw out there, but I don't know enough about them. But I think on a practical level, he's had such an impact and has led to so much of modern ideologies and like the woke stuff and communism and socialism and all that sort of stuff. So if he even deserves to be called a philosopher, but I guess he is considered one. Do you have a thought, Dorian, on who you think is the most harmful philosopher in history? All right. Well, according to my little thing here, we're down to only 2 viewers left, although it doesn't always seem to be accurate. So I don't know. But let's see. All right. Good to see you, Chris. Yeah, I couldn't find a way to send a link. I don't understand. I don't know if you can do that through YouTube. Nope. Doing that wrong. Anyway, it would have been good to have a conversation. I'd probably need to start doing more conversations on here as a way to funnel people into locals. I don't know. Maybe do one of those things. I'm not good at editing. I know a lot of people will do like, oh, the first part of it will be public and the second in locals, but I don't know. Anyway, yeah, I don't know. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? Dorian, if you've got a philosopher who you think is the most harmful, let me know. Yeah, I think one of the reasons I don't is because it's so hard for me. Like I've actually had to turn down a bunch of interviews myself. I've been asked by some people to be interviewed on their channels that I just can't, be hard to do my own. It's not a bad idea, Chris. It's just, it's hard for me to plan those things out because I just don't, I'm so busy, like planning out in advance would be difficult. Hey, Jake, good to see you on here. Quite a bit. We've been on for about an hour and 40 minutes. Talked about social kingship of Christ, political theory, a little bit of nature and grace, theological method. Chris asked me what 5 books would be want to write about. Some questions about Catholics and Orthodox. Worst or most harmful philosopher in history. I said Marx. He's the best I could come up with. Yeah. So quite a bit, a little bit random and, all over the map, but me sort of waxing eloquently on, or not so eloquently on all those sorts of things. Yeah. But yeah, I have this, always internal turmoil of appreciating the scholastics and the communio side and trying to figure out how to bring those two together or to see how they complement each other or how they could be brought into more fruitful collaboration. Yeah, appreciate that, Jake. Yeah. Well, I don't know if there's any more questions or topics people are interested in. Trying to think what else. I know Jake is into fountain pens as well. Got one of my favorites here is my Pilot Custom 823. That's a beautiful writer. I got a little TWSBI Diamond 580. Not sure what ink's in there. I'm going to guess Diamine Oxblood. I think Pilot Iroshizuku Konpeki is in this one, the 823. Like I told people, I bought most of my most expensive fountain pens were definitely purchased many years ago. I can't afford fountain pens anymore. But got a couple of Lamy Safaris. This is the Petrol, I think. This is like a, I don't know what color that is. It's like a brownish color. This is one of my favorites, unfortunately. So this is a Lamy 2000. Great writer. Oh, the Dark Forest ink. Yeah, that's good. I also like the Diamine Sherwood Green. Is another great. Anyway, love this pen. Have not been able to use it in years. Why? Because I was cleaning it and I dropped it like this in the sink and it bent the nib. And I haven't been able to afford to send it off to be fixed or replaced. Sadly, I had another, actually, I think I had 2 other of those in the past. I had they called it had a weird name, like Black Amber or something, but it was actually like a silver metallic. It was a lot heavier than the original Black Macrolon. But I got rid of it because it was heavier, but wasn't really any better. And then I think I had the navy blue Macrolon at some point, but I think I traded both of those in. I also had a Pelikan M800 in green at one point. I loved it. but I traded that in to get the M1005 Stresemann. I actually like the green better than this Stresemann gray one, but the nib on the M1000 series, this is the 1005, is just more bouncy, so I like it better. And then the Homo sapiens Bronze Age by Visconti. This is the old one. This is the Palladium. Because again, these were things I acquired back when finances weren't so difficult. Long before I had a family, I got all this. So can't justify those anymore. But anyway, those are some of my favorite writing implements. Let's see. Any other questions, comments, topics of interest? Yeah, the Lamy Safaris are great as long as you have a traditional grip. Although I think some people, even with a four-fingered grip or whatever they call it, even some of them can deal with it. But the Lamy Safaris are a great value. They really are hard to beat when it comes to the... I find that they write extremely well. I need to ink mine up. Both of mine are not inked right now. I thought I had another one, and I don't know what happened to it. I don't know if I lost it in a move or what, but I had another one of these. But these Lamy Safaris and All-Stars. This might be an All-Star. I had a charcoal Safari at one point too. I don't know how I lose pens. But I can't find some of them. But yeah, the Lamys are great. Like they're just, they've got those, you probably can't see it well in here, but there's little indentations for where your finger and thumb go to help you put them in the proper position. And I find they just write really well, and they're a great everyday workhorse pen. They look good. They feel great to write with. Modernist grip. I don't know exactly what modernist grip means. Is that where you have like the two fingers over the top? You're left-handed. Ooh, that makes it difficult with fountain pens, doesn't it? You have to be careful. You have to change your writing angle if you're using a fountain pen. You have to change it so that you're not wiping the ink with your hand as you write. You have to like go down underneath it versus like a ballpoint. Be curious if you have to do. Yeah. That is difficult as a lefty. Fountain pens can be tough for lefties. You might have to take up Hebrew or something so you can write right to left. Let's see. Anyway, anyone else have any questions, comments, things going on the... I don't always keep up with the YouTube world as much, but if there's anything going on that you guys want me to comment on, I can try. Okay, yeah. I can't imagine. It's got to be tough to be a lefty writing without getting your hands all dirty. I have enough hard time as a right-handed person with that. I used to get like, I think, pencil smudges on my hands. Yeah. Check out Jake's stuff too. He's got locals. What is it? Canon 211? Let me see. I think it's 211. Am I wrong? Didn't mean to click on that. I find these apps hard to navigate now. I don't know why I have such a hard time. Yeah, Canon 211. I got it right. He's got some great interviews on there. I think Feingold is another. You've studied under Feingold. He's an interesting figure because even though he wrote that book like the book on nature and grace, sort of critiquing de Lubac, he still seems to be, both in his background with art and his style. I mean, he's sort of, I kind of see him as a bridge figure between Communio and scholasticism in a way. I have a lot of appreciation for him. I used his, Faith Comes from What Is Heard, Introduction to Fundamental Theology, for some of my institute stuff on the, especially on the modes of credibility. Yeah, he's solid. It's, I don't know, you have some great interviews. Anyway, well, I don't know if anyone has any more questions or topics they want to talk about. Let's see, we covered some of the big ones already. Anyway, I guess I'll just sort of, until I see more questions in the chat, I'll just ramble. But, I've been watching some more stuff on scholastic stuff and trying to do a little more reading on that. And I just think, I do think it's somewhat underappreciated. I mean, it makes me really lament how lacking coverage of the scholastics, including the high and the more contemporary scholastics, like more recent scholastics. It's like they're just not covered a lot in schools anymore. And therefore, it's like there's these whole conversations that were in many ways the basis for even magisterial texts for so long, and they're just not studied anymore. Well, you're doing great work, Jake. So, yeah, I think if it's the whole of theology, that might be a problem, but I really appreciate the intensity. I even saw an interview recently. Larry Chapp was interviewing Matthew Meinhard, and even Larry admitted this, that a lot of times people don't like studying the Scholastics because they don't want to do the hard work. And I think there's some truth in that. Like the Scholastics, are really, they want to nail things down and make really tight arguments about things. And I think there is some value in that on certain questions. I think there might be disagreements or differences of opinion on how much of those things should be settled magisterially and binding on everyone else. But as far as really trying to get to the nitty gritty and make intricate arguments about different positions on different questions is not to be taken lightly. I think, again, this is where I get torn, because I do tend to be like Augustine in some sense, where it's like love and do what you will. Like let's not require more than is absolutely necessary. Like, maybe we shouldn't be defining as many things as we possibly can. But I can still see the beauty and the desire to come to that level of nuance about certain questions and the implications of doctrines, and trying to rectify tensions in the tradition, and to come. I can appreciate the desire to ask those questions and actually attempt a reasonable, highly intellectual answer to those questions. Maybe not all those questions are like central and need to are absolutely necessary, but it's like, like philosophy in some sense, the search for the truth is its own good. It doesn't have to be necessary in order to be beautiful and worthwhile. And I think you look at the amount of detail that goes into, especially when it comes to things like Trinitarian theology, and in particular, I guess that's probably like the prime example. I mean, this scholastics, man, they they dealt with some really difficult things that are really hard to do. But anyway, yeah, thanks, Jake. Appreciate seeing here. Thanks for popping in. Yeah, I mean, I watched some stuff from some scholastic channels and stuff, and it's like, man, like it's like they're speaking a whole different language sometimes, but the sad thing is it's actually part of our patrimony. And why is it that stuff is not a part of a standard education anymore? Is it simply because if you did that, you could do nothing else because it's so complicated? Maybe, maybe it went into too much detail on things, and that's not really, you start losing the most important things, and trying to get into too much detail actually ends up working against you, because you just multiply the requirements of assent more and more, and the damaging with the whole personal relationship aspect, and trusting the influx of grace to have a good spiritual life. I mean, right, maybe, but I don't know. I have an appreciation of the attempt to answer difficult questions very precisely, and that's something that I'm having greater appreciation for, while at the same time not wanting to see any of like the communio side go away either. Like, I don't know. I know I just keep saying that over and over again, but I think that's just true. Like, I see real value in that, and I'd like to see more mutual appreciation on that. All right, Chris Plants. I think it does go back to method. The scholastics did take history seriously, but it's also true that the Gospel of Luke doesn't quite read like a dogmatic manual. No, and that is true too. And that's something, I'm glad you raised that, Chris, because I see the beauty in the desire of the scholastics. This is what I mean by, I'm sort of like a pendulum. I'm like a tennis ball going back and forth on opposite sides of the court constantly. Because that is one criticism, or I want to say criticism. It's not even saying they're wrong. It's just an observation that, Jesus didn't speak in scholastic axioms. It's not like he couldn't have. So there's a reason he didn't do that. And I do sometimes think that Jesus would be like, guys, come on. If that was all that important, I would have told you. Focus on what I did say and live it. Because we can spend a lot of time doing theology rather than living it. And I think that could be a danger at Judgment Day even. Right. Jesus understood himself as the fulfillment of the end of a very long story, not primarily as the conclusion of a very long syllogism. And that's true. And that's where I think historical and biblical theology comes in handy. I think the whole salvation history thing is absolutely necessary. Fulfillment of the Old Testament in the New. Like, all of that is very fundamental. That's where I do think the emphasis on spirituality and mysticism and personal relationship, like, having the relationship with Christ is the most important thing, and that can get lost if you tackle him as if he's a math problem. But I also think there's a diversity of gifts and talents and personalities to where, no, some people, their math is beautiful to them, and that is the way, writing mathematical formulas is the way that they glorify God, if you will. And so that might be part of it, is just the difference in temperaments and personalities and things like that. But yeah, I think that is important as well. So I don't know. Again, that's the tennis ball, back and forth, pros and cons. I do think sometimes Jesus, like, you guys are, you're getting a little bit off in the weeds. Yeah, I think we need both, but on a pastoral level, I do think in some sense there was the need to look back at the big picture again and not, some of these books I've gotten from more scholastic sources, you just read, because one thing I do appreciate, because I am big on organization and structure, and I don't like it when I can't look at a table of contents and immediately be able to perceive the logical structure of the work as a whole and how it's organized. But that's where the scholastics shine, is organization usually. But sometimes you go through the table of contents alone, and you're like, oh my gosh, like 8 levels of subpoints in the table of contents alone. And you can definitely see the logical ordering and structure, but you almost start thinking, well, is there too much detail? And I guess it just depends on the purpose, right? There's a difference between catechesis and entry-level theological studies on the bachelor's and the master's level, and even basic level of doctoral studies. And then there's specialization. And maybe, one of the problems was some of the textbooks were just too detailed in trying to outline every nuance of every possible nook and cranny of every question. Maybe that was unnecessary and could be saved for specialists to write to each other and for each other. Like, not everything, this actually brings me back to something. I was taking an online free course through the Duke University's Fons Vitae. Reinhard Hutter did a series of lectures on Newman's idea of university. It was very interesting, something that Newman said about the university, where he distinguished quite sharply between the goal of a university being primarily pedagogy versus research. And that's research is not the primary purpose of a university. And that kind of struck me, because I started thinking, well, maybe part of the problem is we confuse, because in the modern academy, not everywhere, but in some places, the people doing the research and doing the teaching might be one and the same. The problem with that can be they end up teaching their research, but that's not necessarily appropriate for the pedagogy. Like, students are not necessarily the ones that should be reading the latest and greatest research on given topics, including in theology. And so maybe that's part of the problem, is if you have, if you're doing research, you tend to want to share that research in the classroom, but the classroom might not be the right audience for that research, right? So I think it confuses the audiences, and it confuses the purpose of the university, which is to provide the base education for the particular field, right? And also to unify the fields, which is another problem with universities. As Father Matthew Lamb of Happy Memory used to say, we don't have universities, we have multiversities. Subjects are too divided. There's no unifying principles in the modern academy, which need not be the case, but so often is. But I just thought that was a very interesting point that he was making, because those are two different roles. Like, doing theology for advancing the science and for the purpose of engaging and doing further work with your other fellow theologians is a different task than that of instructing students. And I wonder if not enough distinction is made there between those two functions. and that the two get mixed. And then the further question would be, well, one, what would the researchers in a field like in sciences, it's a little bit more obvious that there's obvious work to be done in research and development outside of the classroom. In theology, it might not be quite as obvious, because how would you pay them? You'd actually have a university that has research professors who rarely teach anything. But that's a lot of salaries to pay. And they might do that for the sake of the name recognition, but it does seem like, how well can someone do both? Like, can you teach a full 3.3 or 4.4 load of courses every academic year while doing good research on top of that? Like, do we need to actually separate those two roles out more than we currently do? Is that part of the problem? And is that why we have such a fractured educational experience? I don't know. I just thought it was a very interesting topic that Newman raised, where he was very insistent that no, the university is not for research. The university is for educating the students, and those are two different jobs. I don't know. I thought that was very intriguing. Anyway. Any other questions, comments, topics, anything? Not sure how many people we have in here right now, but let's see. Am I a big coffee drinker? Yes, I am. As a matter of fact, the vast majority of days, my coffee is espresso. I used to just do espresso shots, sometimes by themselves, or like a sort of breve, which is like foamed half and half, or like a cappuccino. Not quite a full latte. Latte is too much milk. Macchiatos I like, just a dollop of the foam. More recently, because I like having a longer drinking experience than espresso gives me. I didn't used to like Americanos, but I've started to make Americanos on almost a daily basis, where you basically do an espresso shot or double shot, and then you add hot water to make the volume higher. And I don't do like a full, I don't like too much water, because then it gets too watered down. I'm surprised myself, because generally I thought Americano was actually a pejorative term. But I've started enjoying those, because I tried just doing, I'll just use the Bialetti machine, which is like a mocha pot, or, drip coffee. But I tended to not like them. Occasionally like a French press. But I've just found the Americanos are easier to make and basically do the same thing and often taste better, which sort of surprised me. Yeah, I'm a big coffee drinker. I can't drink it too late in the day, though. If I drink caffeine after like 2 p.m., I might not be able to sleep very well. Like, it definitely affects me like longer. Yeah, huge coffee drinker. How about you? Coffee guy? Sometimes I'll do tea. Not first thing. Like, I might do tea as like the second caffeine. I used to drink a lot of diet or zero colas. Don't do that much anymore. I did find them to be effective, though. Like, not as my first dose. I always did coffee in the morning, and then I would sustain myself throughout the day with diet soda. It seemed to work pretty well, actually, for me. Making a pot coffee right now. Good man. I guess it's only 1 in the afternoon for you. I couldn't do that right now because it's 4 here. But I used to do a lot of diet sodas, but not so much anymore. So I usually have my last coffee around between 12 and 2. And I have to cut it off. But yeah, big coffee guy. All right. Well, I don't know if there's any more questions or topics people want to talk about. Hang on for maybe a couple more minutes just to see. If not, we can end it there. It's been 2 hours and 10 minutes already. But yeah, I just wanted to hop on. Been a while since I've been on here. Let's see. I guess, all right, as I wait, let's just say one more thing about the scholastic thing that I think is becoming a problem, or the lack of knowledge of what the scholastics were doing in the earlier 20th century, is that I think a lot of confusion on theological and doctrinal questions is coming about now because so many theologians and bishops included in that, and clergy in general, are so unaware of the status of the questions on these different topics in the preconciliar period that they don't even know how to approach those questions when they come up nowadays. And I think that's difficult. Yes, you can go to more recent magisterial texts on certain things, but you're missing a whole background of how theology was handling those when you don't even know how those topics were being handled. Like, how many times people ask a question, well, I'm not aware of any magisterial texts on this. Doesn't mean there aren't any, it just means they're not aware of them because they don't read a whole lot of preconciliar texts, except maybe in social doctrine going back to Leo XIII. Like what, like, I mean, some of the Mariology questions that have come up in recent YouTube back and forths, right? Like Mary's sinlessness. I don't think I was ever taught anything about that in grad school. I mean, I had my presuppositions and my assumptions, which I think have proven to be correct, but I can't say I studied them. Just the way those things were even being talked about back then, or I didn't even really have, other than because I happened to take one doctoral seminar course on Aquinas and the Incarnation and Passion, I came across, his soteriology. Although you could argue there was some bad soteriology in the scholastics as well, the later scholastics, that is. I don't know. I think there's a certain danger that when you're ignorant of the theological patrimony of just a generation or two prior, that leads to difficulties when if you're trying to argue for, a hermeneutic of continuity or a continuous theology that's in continuity with the past. That's harder and harder to do when the theologians of today are rather ignorant of the earliest 20th century theologians. Right? I think, to not even be aware of the conversations that were going on then makes it harder to do it. No, I would not say no to Vatican II. I don't agree with that at all, Angelica. I think that's a mistake. I think that's bad reading of the council in general and of what it says. But I do think there's been a deterioration of the academy since the council. But I mean, it was already happening before the council. I think that's another mistake. The academy was not necessarily in a great place everywhere before the council either. But I just think it's very difficult when you just ignore the most influential theologians of the generation or two prior to you. It makes it hard to have continuity. And I'm not even saying you can't necessarily argue against them on certain points. It's fine, whatever. But to not even really know of the conversations that were going on and just pretend like they didn't exist, I think is a big problem. And I think that has been a problem in the academy. So I guess what I'm talking about is like, I have 4 degrees in theology, and very little of my education taught anything about early 20th century theology other than Resource Mont folks. So I don't necessarily think that's a good thing. Oh, Merry Christmas, Alana. Good to see you here. So I guess that's what I'm saying is I don't know that that's been positive. There was an article by, I think it was Reno, that made a comment about that, how you have like brilliant communio theologians, and I do think they're brilliant, but they knew the people that they were engaging with. Like they knew the thought that was going on in the scholastic schools. And that was sort of, in some sense, enabled their own brilliance to shine forth. So, because they, but once you lose that context and the knowledge of that context, it makes it harder to actually even understand what they were really doing. So I guess I'm just saying, like, I think it would be helpful to, and again, I don't know how you do it. Like, these things are difficult because you can't cover everything. You just can't. It's not possible. Now, if my own education had been structured in a better way, I would have been primed to have a much better grasp because I spent so many years getting so many different degrees that a lot of that work could have been done. So again, I don't know exactly how you do it, but I think just ignoring, acting like there's nothing that came from that time period of value is really not a good approach. And it makes you somewhat ignorant of what the church was dealing with beforehand, and therefore what is probably still needs to be dealt with today. And I don't know. I mean, I think, and again, it might just be my lived experience. Maybe other people didn't have these same negative experiences, but I would say there wasn't even a whole lot of talk about the different, there were talks about levels of magisterial teaching and the assent required. I mean, that was dealt with. But even knowledge of the theological notes is not something that was really talked about. And how do you actually go through the process of judging or even if it's just your opinion as a theologian, trying to judge the level of certitude. Like that was never really discussed. So I think, I don't know. I just think there's a certain loss there where I feel like I'm ignorant of a whole, not completely ignorant, because obviously I've read things like the Thomistic Response book. So I've read works by, Garrigou and Labordette, and I actually love Labordette, his way of writing. But I do kind of feel like it would have been good to encounter those things more in my education. Now, some of it I did encounter, and again, in my doctoral studies I did. I mean, I had a doctoral seminar course with Christopher Ruddy at CUA that had us read some of those figures. So that was helpful. But other than that, it was pretty much just ignored. Almost as if, I heard more about German liberal Protestant German scholars than I did early 20th century Catholic, close to the magisterium theologians. And I think that's just a problem when you're trying to understand, theology for contemporary society. It's kind of a big lacuna to have in your education. Yeah, exactly, Alana. I was saying that earlier. Like, the more I've studied, the more I realize what I don't know. So I just think, and again, because those works, that's the downside, is those works were so complicated from those figures that how would you have time to study anything other than them? Which I also think would be a problem. But that might be an argument for why maybe textbooks are not all that bad. Summaries of the main points are, without going into every single detail. You save that for specialized books and for further research and reading. But I'm kind of a big fan of textbooks. And again, that might be part of my science background. I was a biology and chemistry student before I switched to theology. And I was speaking with a professor of economics at Steubenville. Like, people are asking him, well, what are the best textbooks in economics? He goes, they're all pretty much the same, right? Because when you're teaching a science or a subject, it is what it is. Like, the basic knowledge you need to teach to an undergrad or to a master's student should be relatively the same no matter where you're at. It doesn't really, the basis of that field the basics are what they are. Like, there's really no reason, pick and choose, might be slight differences in order of presentation or wording, obviously, in style of prose, but the content is going to be roughly the same. It doesn't necessarily matter which organic chemistry textbook you have. They're all going to pretty much cover the same material. Well, I think in some sense we could benefit from something like that in theology today, where there's more of a common basis for education in the academy across schools, which is why I think this is where I would push against something like what Angelica was saying. Vatican II called for this, right? It specifically says, it's talking about the seminaries, but I think it applies to theological education in general. There should be instruction in the Word of God, sacred scripture, in the church fathers, in the history of dogmas, and the speculative theology, capping this all off, the speculative theology of Thomas Aquinas. That's what Vatican II called for. So that's one reason I wouldn't say no to Vatican II. But I can tell you that's not being done in many places. So I think that's what I'm saying is, I'm not saying you have to have only those early 20th century Dominicans, for instance, as your sources, but there should at least be a summary of their thought and the topics they were covering, even if you can't go into all the details, to at least have a general lay of the land of what sort of questions were in the air and what was being dealt with, and what the status of those questions were, and at least a broad, you can do like summaries. You can do broad summaries of, well, these are the theologians that held this position, these are the ones that held that. Even if you can't go through all the nuances of all the arguments in their works, you can at least give a lay of the land so that you're not completely ignorant of the questions that were happening, around those sorts of things. So maybe another example, Chris, would be something like questions about religious liberty, or how that relates to the duties of the individuals and societies to the true religion. I don't think those are things being studied in much depth. It's like, that makes it kind of hard to address those questions now, when you don't even have a good education in the basic outlines of what the basic common positions were, and then where the differences were And that's where things like, I think, textbooks help. Like in my science studies, textbooks were the norm. And I actually kind of thought it was weird when I switched to theology that there weren't many textbooks. I thought that was just kind of odd. So, and I know some of my fellow Communio guys are not big on textbooks. I don't know if all of them would be that way. But again, it's probably my science background, but to me, it just seems natural to have a textbook. And I know, like, you use the manual, Chris, in your teaching, and stuff like that, I think, is helpful. Because you have to give people a basic overview of the fundamentals of the science before they can learn to go off and specialize and do more complex work. But I think now, I think too early on in our educational system, and again, I'm sure it's not the same everywhere. I can't speak for every university. But the specialization starts too early before those fundamentals have actually been laid. This is what Father Matthew Lamb was talking about when I studied under him at Boston College before I switched to CUA. So when he started his, he went to Ave Maria to set up their program. He required a lot of courses and a substantial reading list on top of that, precisely because he felt too many people were getting degrees in theology that didn't have enough education in the breadth of the Catholic tradition. And it was breadth. He didn't narrow it down to one, commentatorial tradition. So it wasn't like replicating the scholastic system per se. It was broader than that. He wanted people to read in a broader tradition, Catholic tradition, which I think is good. But I think it's not like when you're trying, I guess partly it's because I find myself in like these circles where there's the meeting of Communio and scholastics, Thomas, where it can be difficult to have these conversations precisely because of the lack of education on the other side. And I don't even like calling it another side, because I'm not fully convinced that they're really fully at odds. But when you don't even know what the scholastics were doing, it makes it harder to have those conversations. And it's somewhat frustrating when you just feel ignorant about, well, what were they doing? I mean, if all you know about them is that, they're called dry and desiccated, well, that's not really fair, because it's not based on any actual knowledge of what they were doing. Now, it is actually true that some of the works were dry and boring. I mean, that's just true. But some of their questions are absolutely fascinating, and they're dealing with topics. They were dealing with topics back then that I don't even think were ever presented to me as even topics to be done. So I think that's part of what I mean. Anyway, maybe they were just deemed not as important because they were getting too much into detail and missing the forest for the trees. Maybe that's why. I don't know. It's just my own little thing where I feel like I wish I had known more about what they were doing. And now I have to go back and read through it myself. But yeah, that's just my little rant about. And again, I have to admit that it's not like I've come up with the perfect system. It's not easy, but I think the only way I personally can see trying to do what I would like to see done in the academy would require good textbooks that summarize a lot of the main points from different elements within the Catholic tradition. So it would be different than a neo-scholastic approach, which, if you take that to mean, narrowing, restricting yourself to one commentatorial tradition. But, I wouldn't do that. But I do think that commentatorial tradition should be one of the voices in that summary. What text would I use for a fundamental theology grad course? That's a good question. I need to look more into that Belmonte. I've been reading through the sections on the Trinity for that, since I already did my fundamental. I probably would not use Garrigou. I might use Garrigou, his 2 volumes, De Revelatione, as which I've done in the past, as I would pull out sections. I would quote from it, but I probably wouldn't use it as the textbook. Depending on the level of the students, because not all grad students are created equal, Feingold's book is pretty good as a basis. I need to look. I saw that Belmonte had a lot of stuff on fundamental theology. I'd have to read through it to see how it compares with Feingold. But I think Feingold is a good place to start. Ratzinger's, he couldn't be a full text. I mean, that's part of my problem, though, right now. There's not a lot of good textbooks out there, I don't find. So, the Nature, Mission, and Theology is a good read, but it couldn't serve as a real textbook. So, I mean, part of what I'm arguing is there aren't that many great textbooks out there. Now, I do have Mauro Gagliardi's book, Catholic Dogmatic Theology, Truth is its Synthesis, but I haven't read through it yet, and that is more dogmatic theology, which I do tend to emphasize more than I do more systematics or dogmatics than fundamental. Yeah, I'm trying to see if there's anything else on my shelf that jumps out at me. There's whole books on development of dogma. I mean, right now, the only book I know that I could pull off the shelf and use would be Feingold's book or the Belmonte manual. Yeah, I mean, it seems to cover a lot of the bases. I'm very hopeful for the series by Jean-Hervé Nicolas as a dogmatic textbook. I know that Müller also has a dogmatic textbook, but I haven't read it. Oh, when was that sent? Anyway. Yeah, I don't know. I just think it would be helpful that people would get at least some basic common education no matter what university they went to, because that's what it is like in the sciences. And I think theology needs something like that, where you have a basis in knowing the different schools, what they are, what they stood for, what their major positions were, before you start specializing and going off into your, chosen direction for further elaboration. All right, guys. Well, it looks like I have to go because I have to decide what I'm having for dinner, and I'm being asked to submit my order. So, yeah, it is important to have different departments. What am I trying to say? Yeah, I don't know. I think you'd almost have to create all new textbooks in order to make room for the different schools. Because there were different schools in scholasticism, right? And one of the complaints was that it was all being reduced to one school. That was part of the pushback, which, could be considered appropriate. But I also wonder if that's been overdone. Like, it seems to me that some of the scholastics did acknowledge people who held opposite opinions from different schools. So I don't know that it's as true to say that there was no acknowledgement of other alternative positions, but they would take a position which is really hard to do when you don't know what all the positions are and all the arguments for them. But yeah, I just think yeah, anyway, that's my little rant. Anyway, guys, I guess I need to get going. And appreciate you guys being on here for the last 2.5 hours, some of you. Anyway, I could go on and rant forever, but need to get going. All right, thanks for being on here. Appreciate it. And take care. God bless. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.